All right, hello everyone, especially those of you gearing up for your exams. It's been a decade, a whole decade, since the landmark Paris Agreement was signed. So this is a really crucial update on global climate action, and we're going to break down all the latest data so you know exactly where we stand, and most importantly, why it matters.
So let's just cut straight to the chase. If there's one single thing you take away from this entire analysis, it's this. We are way, way off target when it comes to meeting our climate goals. That's the headline, that's the core message you absolutely need to remember. Okay, so here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll take a look back at the last 10 years. Then we'll dive into the record emissions numbers and see who the key players are. We'll compare what's been pledged versus the policies on the ground, check the G20's scorecard, and look at what the future might hold. And then we'll wrap it all up with the key takeaways you'll need for your revision.
So let's jump right into our first section. A decade off target. 10 years after that historic agreement in Paris. Where are we really? Let's find out.
You know, this slide really tells a story with two very different sides. On the one hand, there's some good news. The Paris Agreement has definitely spurred some action. Projections for global warming are down from a scary 4 degrees to below 3. And get this, 70% of global emissions are now covered by some kind of net zero pledge. But, and this is a huge but, there's the other side of the coin. Ambition and, more importantly, implementation are just not keeping up. The new pledges aren't really closing that emissions gap, which puts that all-important 1.5-degree goal at extreme risk.
Okay, let's move on. Section 2 is where we get into the nitty-gritty. We're talking hard data now, the latest emission figures, and who the main contributors are. Time to diagnose the symptoms.
Wow, just take a look at that number. 57.7 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. That is a new, record-breaking total for global greenhouse gas emissions set in 2024. And that 2.3% increase from 2023, that might not sound like a lot, but it is alarmingly high. It's more than 4 times the average growth rate we saw just a decade ago. We are accelerating in the wrong direction.
So what caused this huge spike? Well, this chart breaks it down pretty clearly. Fossil fuels were a big factor, no doubt, at 36%. But look at that massive piece of the pie. Over half, at a staggering 53%, came from something called LULUCF. This was the single most decisive factor in 2024's emissions surge. Okay, exam alert here. LULUCF. You absolutely need to know this acronym. It stands for Land Use Change, and Forestry. Essentially, this covers all the emissions from things like deforestation and how we manage our land. And in 2024, emissions from this sector alone surged by 21%, making it the #1 driver of that overall increase. Now, if we just set LULUCF aside for a moment and look at other emission sources, a few countries stand out. The highest absolute increases came from India and China. And if you're looking at the fastest relative growth, that was Indonesia. It's also worth pointing out that among the 6 largest emitters, only the European Union actually managed to decrease its emissions in 2024. This brings us neatly to Section 3, Pledges versus Policies. So we've diagnosed the problem, right? Now let's analyze the world's prescribed treatment plan, the Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs. And here's another essential piece of jargon for you, NDCs. So what are they? Well, they're basically the climate action plans that each country has to create. They outline exactly how they're going to cut emissions. They really are the core mechanism of the entire Paris Agreement. Now, it's really important to know there are 2 different types of NDCs. First, you have unconditional NDCs. That's what a country says it will achieve on its own, with its own resources. Then you have conditional NDCs. These are more ambitious targets that a country says it can hit, but only if it gets international help, like funding or new technology. And that distinction between what's a firm promise and what's an aspirational goal is absolutely critical. So, are the latest NDCs ambitious enough? The simple answer is no, not even close. They fall way short of the global goal to triple renewable energy capacity. Less than half of them even mention a target for doubling energy efficiency. And on the crucial issue of fossil fuels, the response is just weak. In fact, not a single NDC that's been submitted sets a target to actually reduce oil and gas production. Not one. All right, to help you lock in these key targets for your exam, here's a simple mnemonic for you. Just remember the 3-2-1 goal. That's for tripling renewables, doubling energy efficiency, and it's all one big goal for the planet, all by 2030.
So 3-2-1 goal by 2030. It's a quick way to remember the key areas where the current plans are failing.
Okay, let's sharpen our focus now in Section 4 with the G20 scorecard. These are the world's largest economies, and believe me, their actions are absolutely central to the entire climate story.
So why are we so focused on the G20? Well, this chart makes it crystal clear, doesn't it? Together, the G20 nations are responsible for a massive 77% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. Their collective success or failure pretty much determines the world's climate future. It's that simple. So how are they doing? Well, as a group, they are not on track. There's what's called an implementation gap of about 2 gigatons between their policies and their 2030 promises. And if you break it down, only 7 members look like they'll achieve their targets. 9 of them are either off track or their progress is just plain uncertain. And very few seem to be on a clear path to their long-term net zero goals.
All of this leads us to the big prognosis in Section 5, future warming scenarios. Let's translate all this data into what it actually means for the planet's temperature. This is where it gets real.
This table really quantifies the massive gap we're facing by the year 2035. To stay below 2 degrees of warming, emissions need to be around 36 gigatons. But the current unconditional pledges put us at 48. That's a 12 gigaton gap right there. Now, for the 1.5 degree goal, the number we need to hit is just 25 gigatons. But with pledges at 48, the gap just explodes to a massive 23 gigatons. And this slide shows the real-world consequences. If we just continue on our current path with the policies we have right now, we're headed for about 2.8 degrees of warming. If every single conditional NDC is met, we're looking at 2.3 degrees. And even in the most optimistic, best-case scenario, with every single pledge met, we still land at 1.9 degrees, well above that 1.5 degree target.
Now for our final section, and this one is designed specifically for you to take away for your revision. Let's consolidate all the most important facts and figures into your exam key takeaways.
Okay, let's lock all this in. This is your final summary. The 2024 emissions number, a record 57.7 gigatons, a 2.3% increase. The key driver for that increase was LULECF, contributing 53%. The G20's share of global emissions, a massive 77%. The highest absolute emissions increases, not counting LULECF, came from India and China. Remember, NDCs are the nationally determined contributions, and they're falling short of that 3-2-1 goal. The G20 implementation gap for 2030 is about 2 gigatons. The 2035 emissions gap is about 12 gigatons for a 2-degree path and a whopping 23 gigatons for a 1.5-degree path. And what does that mean for warming? Current policies put us on a track for about 2.8 degrees Celsius. Even the best-case scenario with every pledge met still leads to 1.9 degrees. And all of this reinforces that one core message: the world is off target.
So we'll end with this question for you to really think about. With that 1.5 degree goal now slipping out of reach, what kind of unprecedented, truly transformative action and international cooperation is actually required to steer us away from this dangerous path? It really is the defining question of our time.